There is a silence that falls in a courtroom just before a verdict is read. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of consequence. Thousands of lives compressed into one suspended moment, holding their breath as history prepares to speak. On November 9th, 1999, that silence fell over the special court in Mumbai. 7 years of hearings, cross examinations, adjournments, constitutional challenges, and Supreme Court interventions had all led to this room, this moment, this single man. The man in the dock had aged visibly since the day his name first appeared on a newspaper front page that shook India to its foundation. His hair had turned completely white. He had suffered 2 heart attacks during the years of trial. His assets, every rupee, every property, every luxury vehicle had been frozen by a court-appointed custodian under a law that had not existed before his own case made Parliament write it. His empire was gone, his reputation was ash. And yet, even now, standing in that dock with the silence pressing in, there was something in his eyes that looked like a man who still believed his intelligence would find a way out. His name was Harshad Shantilal Mehta, and he had once held the entire Bombay Stock Exchange in the palm of his hand. To understand what Harshad Mehta did, truly understand it, you must first understand the India of the early 1990s. Not the India of today with its electronic trading platforms, dematerialized securities, and real-time SEBI surveillance. The India of 1990 was a country still emerging from 4 decades of the license Raj. Banks were nationalized and governed through the Banking Regulation Act of 1949, which gave the Reserve Bank of India supervisory powers under Section 35 to inspect bank operations and regulate the instruments they used. But those powers were designed for a slower, simpler world. The Securities Contracts Regulation Act of 1956 governed securities markets in principle, but SEBI, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, was given real statutory power only in January 1992, barely 3 months before the scam broke. The stock market was a niche world operating through physical paper documents and a system of trust that was almost entirely unverified. And in the gap between that slow, paper-based regulatory world and the fast, ambitious financial reality that was emerging, Harshad Mehta found his opportunity. He had been born in Raipur in 1954 into a modest Gujarati family. His father worked in textiles. The family moved often, Raipur, then Bombay, then Bhilai, chasing small opportunities in a controlled economy that offered few large ones. After studying commerce at Lajpat College in Mumbai, Harshad cycled through unremarkable jobs. He sold hosiery. He worked as a dispatch clerk at New India Insurance Company. He drove taxis for a period. None of it matched the combination living inside him. A ferocious mathematical intuition, an extraordinary ability to read human motivation, and a reckless, all-consuming appetite for risk. Then, in 1981, a relative helped him get a position as a jobber's assistant at the Bombay Stock Exchange. The BSE trading floor was loud, chaotic, and entirely physical, a place where personality and split-second judgment made and lost fortunes in minutes. Harshad Mehta walked onto that floor and felt, for the first time in his life, that he had arrived exactly where he belonged. He learned the market with an intensity that impressed everyone around him. By 1984, he had registered as a sub-broker. By 1986, he had established Gromor Research and Asset Management with a growing reputation as someone who could identify value before the market caught up, who had the courage to take large positions when others were cautious. He understood that Indian markets were fundamentally undervalued and that the coming liberalization would reprice Indian companies dramatically upward. His thesis was not wrong. The tragedy is that his method of acting on it was catastrophic. Executing his strategy required enormous capital, and capital for an independent broker without inherited wealth was almost impossible to access legitimately. And so, Harshad Mehta looked at the banking system, studied it with extraordinary care, and found the crack. The instrument he exploited was called a ready forward deal, an RF deal. Under the guidelines of the Reserve Bank of India and the Banking Regulation Act of 1949, a ready forward deal was a routine short-term borrowing mechanism between banks. Bank A has surplus cash sitting idle for 15 days. Bank B needs temporary liquidity. Bank B temporarily sells its government securities to Bank A, promising to repurchase them after 15 days at a slightly higher price. The difference is the interest. The government securities serve as collateral, safe, guaranteed by the state. Everything was confirmed through a bank receipt, a BR, issued by the selling bank to verify that specific securities had been transferred. The system assumed completely and without exception that every bank receipt was genuine, that behind every piece of paper the securities actually existed. No systematic verification mechanism existed anywhere in the chain. The system ran on institutional trust. Harshad Mehta understood this with surgical precision, and he exploited it without hesitation. The mechanics of his fraud, once understood, are simultaneously simple and audacious. Banks would give Harshad funds nominally for RF deals in government securities. Instead of buying securities, he diverted the funds directly into the stock market. He purchased massive coordinated blocks of specific shares. Most famously, he bought ACC cement so aggressively that its price rose from around 200 rupees in 1991 to over 10,000 rupees by April 1992, a 50-fold increase in just 18 months. These large purchases attracted other investors who saw the rising prices and followed. Retail investors who had never owned a share in their lives began opening trading accounts. Harshad would then sell at the elevated price, bank the profit, return the original capital plus promised interest to the bank, and the bank had no reason to ask further questions. Everything appeared legitimate. No one asked to see the underlying government securities because no one had built a system that required them. The reason no verification existed was the bank receipt itself. Two small cooperative banks, the Bank of Karad and the Metropolitan Cooperative Bank, were issuing bank receipts with absolutely no securities behind them. Fraudulent documents manufactured entirely on demand. Under Section 420 of the Indian Penal Code, cheating by dishonestly inducing delivery of property carries imprisonment of up to 7 years. Under Section 467, forgery of a valuable security is punishable with life imprisonment. Under Section 468, forgery for the purpose of cheating, and Section 471, knowingly using a forged document as genuine, the entire chain of each fraudulent RF transaction was criminal at every single step. But the larger banks, State Bank of India, National Housing Bank, UCO Bank, were accepting these BRs without independent verification. The Securities Contracts Regulation Act of 1956, under Section 12A, prohibited manipulative practices in securities markets. But SEBI had no enforcement machinery in place. The law existed on paper, the regulatory teeth did not. And Harshad Mehta had known this for years. The scale of what he built was staggering. By early 1992, he was moving between 1,500 and 2,000 crore rupees through the banking system every single day. The Bombay Stock Exchange Sensex, at roughly 1,000 points in January 1990, climbed to 4,500 by April 1992, a rise of 350% in just over 2 years. Nothing in Indian economics justified this. No breakthrough had occurred. The businesses soaring in price were the same ones that had traded at a fraction of those values 18 months earlier. But ordinary Indians, school teachers, retired clerks, small businessmen were pouring their savings in, trusting that the extraordinary returns were real, that the big bull knew something they did not. And Harshad Mehta, appearing on television and in every business magazine with supreme confidence, did nothing to discourage that trust. He needed it. It was the fuel the machine required. He was living at a scale India had never publicly witnessed from a private individual. A 15,000 square foot penthouse in Worli overlooking the Arabian Sea. A Lexus when there were perhaps only a handful in the entire country. Golf at premium clubs. Donations to charities and educational institutions carefully publicized. Television interviews in which he spoke about wealth creation with the authority of someone who had genuinely cracked the code. He was on magnificent display, reveling in the attention and admiration and the fear his name generated on the trading floor. On the surface, the story of liberalization working exactly as intended. A man from modest origins reaching extraordinary heights. Beneath the surface, 31 banks sitting on a time bomb of fraudulent paper. And in a small office at the Times of India, a 31-year-old journalist named Sucheta Dalal was methodically and patiently getting closer to it. Dalal had been noticing things for months. She followed the documents, not the press releases, not the celebratory profiles, not the television interviews, the actual documents. She had sources inside the banking system, careful people who passed her fragments at considerable personal risk. She saw patterns, money flowing from banks into equity markets through a single broker in amounts no legitimate brokerage could explain. Share prices moving without any change in business fundamentals. A name, Harshad Mehta, at the center of every anomaly. For months, she verified, cross-checking figures against public filings, consulting financial experts who confirmed that what she was describing was not a creative use of the RF deal mechanism, but a fundamental subversion of it. And on April 23, 1992, the Times of India published her article. It was precise, it was specific. It named Harshad Mehta directly and described the fraud in enough detail that any banker reading it would immediately understand what had been done with their institution's money. India read that article on the morning of April 23rd. By afternoon, the Bombay Stock Exchange was in free fall. The Sensex lost 570 points, roughly 13%, on the single day the article appeared. In the weeks that followed, it lost more than 40% of its peak value. The wealth destruction was catastrophic. Estimates of investor losses run into tens of thousands of crores of rupees. People who had invested retirement funds, children's education money, savings built over decades watched it all evaporate in days. There were suicides, families were destroyed. Dreams built painstakingly over a lifetime disappeared in the time it took to read a newspaper. The retail investor had trusted a system built on fraudulent paper, and when the paper was exposed, there was nothing underneath it. Finance Minister Manmohan Singh ordered an immediate investigation. The Reserve Bank of India began examining the books of every bank involved. The Central Bureau of Investigation was called in under the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act of 1946. The Joint Parliamentary Committee on Securities Scam examined witnesses for months and documented the systemic failures with extraordinary specificity. What investigators found was worse than the most pessimistic estimates. 31 banks had participated in fraudulent RF transactions. Total funds diverted were estimated at 3,500 to 5,000 crore rupees. The National Housing Bank, established to support housing finance for ordinary Indians, had been defrauded of over 1,200 crore rupees alone. The State Bank of India had losses running into hundreds of crores. The scale went far beyond what any existing legal mechanism was equipped to handle. Tell us in the comments where you are listening to this story from. If this story made you think differently about what financial regulation really means, please like, subscribe, and share this channel. Every subscriber tells us to keep bringing stories like this. Now, back to the story. Writing hand, a note from our team. We have researched this case extensively to bring you accurate facts, dates, and legal details. However, these cases span years of complex proceedings and some details may be imperfect. If you spot anything that needs correction, please leave it in the comments. Your input helps us serve every listener better. Parliament's response was swift and without precedent. The Special Court Trial of Offences relating to transactions in Securities Act of 1992 created a dedicated court with exclusive jurisdiction over these securities fraud offences. More significantly, under Sections 3 and 11, it created the office of a custodian with sweeping powers to attach all assets of accused persons from the date of the court's order, before any conviction, simply on the basis of being named as accused. A legal innovation with no precedent in Indian law. The Supreme Court, in a series of landmark orders, affirmed the custodian's authority and directed all recovered assets toward repaying the defrauded banks. 27 criminal cases were filed against Harshad Mehta, each addressing different banks, different transactions, different dimensions of the fraud, all involving violations of the Banking Regulation Act of 1949, the Securities Contracts Regulation Act of 1956, and IPC sections 420, 467, 468, and 471. Harshad Mehta was arrested on November 9, 1992. He did not flee. He continued giving interviews and maintaining public defiance. Then, in January 1993, he detonated the most explosive press conference in Indian political history, publicly claiming he had paid 1 crore rupees in cash to Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao as a bribe. The claim exploded across every front page. It was never conclusively proven in court. But it demonstrated something essential about his character. Even after the game was demonstrably over, he never stopped trying to play it. The hearings in the special court stretched over years. His legal team argued that RF deal irregularities were systemic, that other brokers had engaged in similar practices, that he had been singled out for his prominence. There was a fragment of truth in this. The RBI confirmed that ready-forward irregularities were not confined to Harshad alone. But his scale was in a category entirely of its own. His coordinated manipulation of specific stocks, including ACC, Sterlite Industries, Apollo Tyres, and Videocon under Section 12A of the Securities Contracts Regulation Act, his systematic use of fraudulent instruments across 31 institutions, his sustained exploitation of absent verification mechanisms over 4 consecutive years, these were not incidental irregularities. They were a designed architecture of fraud constructed with intelligence and maintained with discipline. Consider the bank officials who participated. Some genuinely did not know what Harshad was doing with the funds. They processed transactions authorized by seniors, saw returns arrive on schedule, and had no institutional framework that required them to question further. The law is specific here. Section 420 of the IPC requires a dishonest intention, a guilty mind. Where there was no such intention, criminal liability does not straightforwardly attach. But some officials knew more. The line between negligence and complicity is not always clear in financial fraud cases, and the CBI investigation found itself drawing that line carefully across dozens of individual cases. The prosecutions that followed were selective, contested, and in some cases never concluded. But the institutional culture that allowed it, the culture of accepting extraordinary returns without asking where they came from, that culture was the real defendant, and it is the one that the reforms most durably changed. In November 1999, the Special Court delivered its first conviction, cheating in the State Bank of India case under Section 420 of the IPC and the Special Court Act. Harshad and his brother Sudhir Mehta were sentenced to rigorous imprisonment. He appealed. The legal battles continued. His health was collapsing, 2 heart attacks having taken a visible toll. And on December 31, 2001, in Thane Central Jail, Harshad Shantilal Mehta suffered a massive heart attack and died. He was 47 years old. Of the 27 cases filed against him, only one had been fully resolved. The remaining 26 died with him. The big bull's last day was the last day of the 20th century. The institutional consequences reshaped India's financial architecture permanently. SEBI, empowered by the Securities and Exchange Board of India Act of 1992, received sweeping new powers to investigate, penalize, and prosecute. The Depositories Act of 1996 created the National Securities Depository Limited, moving all securities to electronic form and making fraudulent bank receipts permanently impossible. The National Stock Exchange, launched in 1994, introduced screen-based electronic trading that eliminated the opacity of the physical trading floor entirely. Every major structural reform in India's capital markets between 1992 and 2000 traces directly to the gaps that Harshad Mehta exploited. The market capitalization of Indian equities, roughly 1.5 trillion rupees at the time of the scam, stands today at over 300 trillion. That growth was built on the institutional framework constructed on the ruins of what he destroyed. What does this story teach us? First, the law and its enforcement are entirely different things. The Banking Regulation Act, the Securities Contracts Regulation Act, the IPC provisions on cheating and forgery all existed in 1992. The law was present. The enforcement was absent. A law without enforcement is not a constraint. It is an invitation. Second, systemic risk is never the creation of one person alone. Harshad Mehta did not force 31 banks to participate. He persuaded them. He created conditions in which professional judgment was overridden by the immediate visibility of extraordinary returns. The culture of those institutions allowed it. Every person who signed a document, they should have questioned shares in what followed. Third, and most fundamentally, intelligence without integrity is not an asset. It is a liability to every system it inhabits and ultimately to the individual who possesses it. Harshad Mehta was, by almost any measure, one of the most financially intelligent individuals India had ever produced. He directed all of that intelligence toward exploitation rather than creation. And the structure he built, brilliant, complex, and entirely fraudulent, carried within it from the very first fraudulent bank receipt the certainty of its own destruction. There is one final thing this story asks of every person who has listened to it. In every organization, in every industry, in every era of economic growth, there exists the social pressure to not ask questions when the returns are good, when the numbers look excellent, when the most admired person in the room is the one generating the returns, and questioning those returns makes you the pessimist, the obstructionist, the person who doesn't understand how the new world works. That pressure is the most dangerous force in finance. It operated in 1992, it operates today. The obligation of every professional, in banking, in investment, in any institution where trust is the foundation of daily work, is to ask the question that the moment of prosperity makes most uncomfortable. Is this real? The answer to that question, asked early and answered honestly, is the only thing that can prevent the next Harshad Mehta from doing what this one did. Sucheta Dalal received the Padma Shri in 2006. Her article of April 23, 1992 remains the most consequential piece of financial journalism ever published in India. It did not merely expose a fraud, it forced a system to look at itself honestly. And in doing so, it built the foundation on which every Indian investor stands today. Harshad Mehta wanted to be remembered as the man who moved the market. He is remembered instead as the man who made the case for making it honest. The specific legal mechanism that made Harshad Mehta's prosecution so complex was the simultaneous operation of criminal proceedings, civil recovery proceedings, and the custodian's asset attachment process across 3 different tracks. In the criminal track, each of the 27 cases required proof of specific individual transactions, specific fraudulent bank receipts, and specific banks defrauded. A painstaking exercise in reconstructing thousands of individual dealings from documents that were themselves often incomplete or contested. In the civil track, the defrauded banks filed separate suits to recover their losses. And in the custodian track, operating under the Special Court Act sweeping powers, the process of identifying, attaching, valuing, and liquidating Harshad Mehta's assets proceeded simultaneously. These 3 tracks did not always move at the same speed or produce consistent results. Court orders from one track sometimes created complications in another. The custodian's process of recovering assets for the benefit of the defrauded banks was, by the end, a partial success. Meaningful amounts were recovered, but a fraction of the total loss. The gap between what was recovered and what was lost was paid silently and permanently by the ordinary investors who had no standing in any of these proceedings. There is also the question of what Harshad Mehta's story reveals about the relationship between financial genius and financial ethics, a question that has no comfortable answer. Harshad Mehta was genuinely brilliant. This is not a charitable observation but a factual one. His understanding of the RF deal mechanism, of how trust and verification gaps interacted in the interbank market, of how coordinated buying in specific stocks could generate momentum that attracted retail investors and thereby funded further cycles of the fraud, all of this reflected a level of financial insight that most professional market participants of his era simply did not possess. He saw the system's architecture with unusual clarity. He saw precisely where its assumptions could be exploited. And having seen all of this, he chose exploitation over engagement, personal enrichment over institutional contribution, the short-term accumulation of fictitious wealth over the slower but genuine creation of value. The law has a word for this choice: fraud. But the law's word does not fully capture the specific tragedy of a mind capable of genuine contribution, choosing instead to destroy. The question of why some people make this choice, why intelligence and moral courage so frequently travel separately in human beings, is one that goes beyond any legal analysis. It is a question about character. And character, unlike intelligence, is not distributed in proportion to mentor capacity. The legacy of the Harshad Mehta scam can be measured in 2 very different ways. The first measurement is in the losses. The investors ruined, the savings evaporated, the trust in Indian financial institutions damaged in ways that took years to repair. The regulatory failures exposed, the ordinary people who paid the price for a system that was not adequately protecting them. These losses are real and they were not evenly distributed. The people who lost the most were not the bankers and financiers who had participated knowingly or carelessly in the fraud. Most of those institutions were eventually made at least partially whole by the custodian's recovery process and by government support. The people who lost the most were the school teachers and retired clerks and small businessmen who had trusted that the extraordinary returns were real. The second measurement is in the reforms. The SEBI Act, the Depositories Act, the National Stock Exchange, the digitized settlement infrastructure, the regulatory framework that made India's capital markets into something that could support the extraordinary economic growth of the decades that followed. Both measurements are real. Both must be held simultaneously to understand what happened in 1992. The scam was not ultimately a story of one man's crime. It was a story of what a country does when its systems fail catastrophically and publicly, and whether it has the institutional capacity, the political will, and the honest self-examination required to build something better from the failure. What Harshad Mehta ultimately showed India is that financial markets are not self-correcting mechanisms. They are not systems that automatically identify fraud and purge it. They are systems of human judgment, human trust, and human incentive. And they perform only as well as the institutions and cultures that govern them. The Sensex does not independently know that a price has been manipulated. The interbank settlement system does not independently flag a forged bank receipt. The retail investor does not independently know that the returns they are receiving are funded by fraud. All of these protections require human systems, human vigilance, and human institutions operating with adequate power and genuine independence. The Harshad Mehta scam was the brutal and expensive demonstration that those systems in 1992 were not adequate. The reforms that followed were India's investment in making them so. Every market participant in India today, every investor who buys a share electronically, every bank that settles a securities transaction through a verified digital system, every fund manager whose trades are monitored in real time by SEBI's surveillance systems is the beneficiary of an infrastructure built partly in response to what one man from Raipur showed a nation about the cost of inadequate regulation. Consider now the specific individuals who handed Harshad Mehta the money. The bank officials, treasury managers, and senior executives who believed or chose to believe that the returns being generated were legitimate. The RBI's own investigations confirmed that ready forward deal irregularities were not unique to Harshad alone. Other brokers had used interbank funds for equity investments. Other institutions had issued bank receipts that did not fully reflect the securities behind them. This was, in a limited but real sense, a systemic practice. Harshad Mehta's crime was not that he invented something that no one else was doing. His crime was that he did it at a scale, with a deliberateness, and with a structural sophistication that placed it in an entirely different category of harm. 31 banks, thousands of individual transactions, an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 crore rupees diverted. An entire national market inflated to fictional heights and then allowed to collapse on the savings of ordinary people who had done nothing wrong except trust the numbers they were shown. The distinction matters because understanding it is the only way to understand why the law's response, the Special Court Act, the custodian, the sweeping asset attachment powers was so extraordinary. The ordinary provisions of Indian criminal law were adequate for ordinary financial fraud. They were not adequate for this. The Parliamentary Joint Committee, constituted to examine the scam, produced reports that remain, even today, among the most honest documents of institutional self-examination in Indian political history. The JPC heard testimony from the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, from Finance Ministry officials, from the Chairman of SEBI, from senior bank executives, and from brokers and auditors who had watched the machinery operate and said nothing. The committee's reports named failures that were uncomfortable and specific. The RBI had supervisory powers under Section 35 of the Banking Regulation Act that it was not effectively exercising. Internal audit processes in nationalized banks were so inadequate that systematic fraud of this scale could operate for years without triggering a single internal alarm. The stock exchange's own surveillance systems were essentially non-existent. And SEBI was a regulatory body in name only, with insufficient budget, insufficient staff, and no enforcement machinery worthy of the name. These were not gentle observations, they were institutional verdicts. And the reforms they recommended, stronger SEBI powers, electronic settlement, independent verification of securities transactions, strengthened bank audits, mandatory risk management frameworks were, over the following decade, substantially implemented. Not perfectly, not without resistance, but implemented. The JPC's work was the bridge between the catastrophe of 1992 and the more robust market that made India's subsequent growth story possible. The ordinary investors who lost everything in April 1992 received almost no compensation. There was no investor compensation fund in India in 1992. There was no regulatory mechanism designed to make retail investors whole after market manipulation. They were simply on their own. Many of them never financially recovered. Not merely in terms of money, but in terms of their relationship with the idea that the stock market could be a safe and honest place for ordinary people to build wealth. Rebuilding that trust, alongside rebuilding the institutions, was the slow, unglamorous, unfilmed work that followed the scam. The work done by regulators, legislators, and market participants who believed that the Indian capital market could be something better than what it had been. That work, done year by year through the 1990s and into the 2000s, made possible every rupee that every ordinary Indian investor has earned from the market since. It is not a dramatic story. It never made a television series, but it is the story that matters most because it is the story of a broken system deciding to repair itself. The web series Scam 1992 brought Harshad Mehta's story to a generation born after his death and made it the most watched Indian original series of its era. Young investors watching during the COVID-era bull market found in the story both a cautionary tale and an uncomfortable source of fascination. That discomfort is correct and important. The combination of ambition, intelligence, and moral failure that defined Harshad Mehta is not unique to him. It recurs throughout financial history because it reflects something persistent in human nature. The temptation, for those who understand a system better than its guardians do, to use that understanding for personal advantage rather than for the system's honest improvement. Every generation of financial professionals must confront that temptation in their own specific context. The specific fraud changes. The fundamental contest between exploitation and vigilance does not. The Harshad Mehta scam was India's introduction to that permanent contest at the very dawn of its economic liberalization. The market that exists today, stronger, more transparent, more carefully supervised, and more genuinely capable of serving the savings of ordinary Indians than anything that existed before April 23, 1992, is the permanent monument to that introduction and to the determination of the people who responded by building something better. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that a brilliant mind without a conscience is the most dangerous thing a financial system can encounter, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you know of a case that deserves to be told, write to us. Every injustice has a story worth telling. This is HeartLine Justice, where the law meets the human heart.